Right, yeah, so I am a PhD researcher at Trobe University. Before I start, I'd first like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands I'll be talking about today, and their elders past, present, and emerging, and any elders that may be in the audience today. Right, so what am I doing my PhD on? I'm investigating how post-colonial industry shaped Victoria's landscape and the implications of that for Aboriginal cultural heritage and its management. So I will break that, what all that means in just a second. But for those who are from overseas and may not know where Victoria is specifically, so at the southeast corner of Australia. So what am I referring to when I say post-colonial landscape change? I'm referring to broad-scale changes to the landscape by activities such as mining, urban development, railway construction, basically just large-scale changes that have resulted in what we can refer to as altered ground surfaces. And so here's a couple examples. These examples are from mining, historical mining. And so on the left, you can see an excavated area near Castlemaine in 1861. And you can just see the amount that the ground surfaces have been affected. And this is very typical in these goldfield areas. And on the right side, you can see Ballarat, 1861 again. In the forefront, you actually have a dam. And then you can see the stratigraphy there. Obviously, you've had ground surfaces that have been affected by mining. And in the background, lots of pockmarked landscape with lots of mine shafts. But all of that material that was dug away had to go somewhere. And a lot of it ended up in the waterways where it was processed to get the gold, to extract the gold. And it would eventually end up to hundreds of kilometers downstream of these gold working areas. And it blanketed landscapes. And this material is known as sludge. And so you've got hundreds of square kilometers downstream of areas such as Bendigo and Ballarat that have been blanketed by thick layers of sediment. And the whole of Victoria, we're talking about 650 million cubic meters of sediment that were moved in the 19th century. If you include the 20th century, you're looking at about 1 billion cubic meters. So we're talking about many amounts of huge areas, basically. Another form of landscape change that I'm looking at is urbanization. Now, this is an aerial image and LiDAR from Ballarat showing a railway embankment and some other urban features. And you can see on the right in the LiDAR that you've got a lot of patterned landscape there, change there. And so you've got some areas that have been dug away, but you also have areas that have been raised. And so you've got a mix of this landscape change. And so what are the implications of that? Well, all that moving around of material during the 19th and early 20th century has resulted in buried ground surfaces. So on the left, that's along Bendigo Creek, and you can see a stump from a tree that was chopped down in the 19th century that is now buried by 2 meters of sediment. The top right, you've got Aboriginal cultural heritage in Bendigo that's been buried and capped by mining sediment. And on the bottom right, you've got your ubiquitous urban fill, which you'll find across urban areas, all throughout Australasia, but the world generally. And you've got 19th century structural remains and buried ground surfaces, again, potentially with Aboriginal cultural heritage beneath that fill. So in terms of implications, we can think about this both in terms of the site formation perspective, so the physical implications, so how has the archaeological record physically been shaped? But you can also look at it from a cultural heritage management perspective, which begs the question whether an area was disturbed by post-colonial activities or whether it was protected. Or another question you could ask is there potential to encounter in situ archaeological material during this given development project? But before we can do that, with all these different types of landscape change activities that we're looking at that can be present in the given archaeological site, we need to have a way of categorizing those changes. And so I'll provide some examples of how we can categorize them. So here's our hypothetical oversimplified ground section. So you've got topsoil, cultural heritage, natural clay, and bedrock. So the British Geological Survey have categorized artificial ground. And this is what they refer to as made ground, which is an anthropogenic deposit capping a former ground surface. But as I refer to it, it's remade ground and an acknowledgement of pre-colonial uses of that landscape. And so you basically got a capped ground surface with cultural heritage deposits in, or the potential for heritage deposits. You've got works ground, which is where those prior ground surfaces have been completely removed and remain barren today. So cellars, swimming pools, road cuttings, any activity that has removed those prior ground surfaces and remains clear today. And if that gets filled in, then we can call that infilled ground. And so that could include landfills, filled in cellars, and old gold workings. And it's important to note that these infilled areas could also have cultural heritage, in situ even, so they're still of archaeological significance. So that's very good, we can categorize them all, but how do we identify whether these are present at an area that we're going to develop? So there's historical research, LiDAR, subsurface exposures, augering, excavation, ground penetrating radar, and what I'm going to talk about today is 3D modeling. So for our first case study area, this is Melbourne CBD. This is a painting that was done 17 years after Melbourne was founded, and you can see there's still quite a lot of undulations in the landscape. And in the bottom left corner, you can see this mountain. Well, not a mountain, it's a hill, but Batman's Hill. And if we fast forward to 1882, here's another painting done. You can see the landscape looks a bit flatter. You've got a lot more buildings, but in the top left, bottom left corner, there's no longer Batman's Hill. It's been removed, and there's now a railway terminus. So where did all that material end up? Well, we find a lot of it in the archaeological record, and a lot of those low-lying undulating areas were filled in by that fill. And across the CBD, archaeologists have been finding built structural remains from the 1850s beneath upwards of 2 meters of these fill deposits. And so as part of my PhD, I wanted to figure out, can we identify other areas where you've got built remains underground, as well as Aboriginal cultural heritage as pre-colonial ground surfaces. So to do so, I took this contour map of Melbourne from 1853, I geo-referenced it, and then I traced all the contour lines and got point data that was shown on the map and digitized that. And from all of that data, I was able to produce this digital elevation model of the grid from 1853. Now this is great, you can see the undulations, but we need to have a point to compare this to in order to measure that 19th century change. Thankfully, we have these series of maps that were produced in 1895 that were made to develop a subsurface drainage system throughout the city. If we zoom in, you can see that across these maps, they have lots of elevation data within building footprints. They're very detailed. I traced all those building footprints, which also include cellars, and with individual elevation points. I then took 22 of those maps and georeferenced all of them. And then that little red square is where we were just looking, and I traced all of them. And so that's 11,200 elevation points and 5,600 building footprints. And from that, I was able to create an elevation model from 1895. And what's great about this is that each individual building has its own interpolated elevation, and then the broader streetscape has its own elevation as well. So I was able to capture elevation of the wider surfaces and then the interior surfaces, including cellars. Now, by subtracting the 1853 model from the 1895 model, here's our 1853 again, 1895, I was able to produce this model. So this model is basically the difference between the two models. And so on the bottom left, you can see Batman's Hill, which has indeed been removed. But you can also see cellars right across the CBD. And so these are areas that we might refer to as works ground. And then we've got these areas of green, which are areas that have raised. So since the 1850s, these areas were higher by 1895 and thus have higher potential to have archaeology. And so if we zoom into that area I showed you before with 2 meters of elevation increase, here's it over the 1895 map. The area in the rectangle had 2 meters, which the archaeological excavations discovered. And the modeling shows 2 meters, 2 to 2.5 meters of elevation increase. And so this modeling could have confirmed or at least predicted whether they were going to be fill deposits before they started their works. So what can we use this for? Well, we can compare that model to heritage inventories, archaeological investigations, historical record, LiDAR, and other sources of elevation data. Here I've done that. I've clipped my model to the Heritage Victoria's heritage database. And over the top of it, I've got Aboriginal cultural heritage sensitivity. And so this is basically a new type of predictive mapping that could be used to establish the likelihood that you've got cultural heritage before works begin. Right, got not a lot of time, but I'll just have one more case study. I've got Ballarat. So the area I was talking about before, Ballarat has urbanization, but it also has gold mining. I again mapped from 1858. I traced all the contour lines within GIS, and I was able to create this model from 1858. And then here's LiDAR. And so if I go backwards and forwards, you can see some pretty large scale changes. So we resume back into that area I showed you before with the LiDAR. We can now look at it in terms of elevation change rather than just looking at it in terms of its elevation. And so you can see, if I do this next map, this is a 19th century 1861 map. You can see that very likely they took the material to build the railway embankment came from that reserve adjacent. And you can see the sludge channel that runs up through has indeed dug into the original ground surface. And if you look at these lower areas, you can sort of say, okay, well, these areas have higher potential, or these areas have slightly less potential. And this is what it looks like as a potential end user output. So you've got cadastral boundaries, and you've got a model showing potential layers of fill and amounts of fill. So in terms of implications for cultural heritage management, this could lead to an improved understanding of ground conditions before development projects get started. It's a new form of archaeological predictive mapping. It's a means of focusing limited cultural heritage management resources, and it could help developers to avoid areas of higher heritage potential, remade ground, by predicting areas with lower potential or worked ground. And just final discussion. So just to reiterate, the 19th century was a formative period for many parts of our contemporary landscape. In some cases, 19th century activities caused disturbance to Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal cultural heritage, but not always. The use of terms like remade ground, work ground, or infill ground could offer a standardized way of categorizing changes to ground surfaces. GIS and 3D modeling offer a powerful means of establishing the potential for artificial ground across urban areas, and identifying examples of artificial ground during the planning stages of development could lead to better cultural heritage management outcomes while saving time and resources for developers. I've got 2 papers out, which I basically detail the methodology and some of the theory behind all this stuff. So if you are interested in doing any of this modeling, look at those papers. They're all freely available on my ResearchGate. You can also email me if you have any questions. All right, thank you.